This revision video is for the poem As Imperceptibly as Grief, and it's for the question stems on poetry A and B. Okay, let's talk to you a little bit about context. Now, this poem was written by Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson composed and revised and created hundreds of poems during a relatively intense and short period of time. 1858 to 1865, which importantly overlaps a crucial time in American Civil War. Now, Emily Dickinson was American. She was from Massachusetts, okay? And it's really important that you understand there was a lot of conflict going on in around the time that she wrote this poem. Only 8 of her poems were published during her lifetime. The rest were being circulated in manuscript form among her friends and family, and many poems exist in more than one version. And in fact, Imperceptibly of Grief, the structure of that actually altered. She changed that herself when she was revising it. After her death, she became an overnight sensation and she was extremely popular. Now, Emily Dickinson was also a Puritan. That means that she believed very much in God and that God was everywhere and also in nature. She believed that God's will was also in nature. And this heavily influences her poetry, along with the metaphysical poems of the 17th century. She admired the works of Elizabeth Barrett and John Keats. For many years, she lived in isolation, and she was also quite sad and alone. And much of this sadness and seclusion is demonstrated in the poem Imperceptibly as Grief. Now, if we just look at the poem and the title very quickly, okay, you can see there that word imperceptibly as grief. Now, imperceptibly means very subtle, okay? Not particularly noticeable, but it is there nonetheless. And grief has connotations to the word of death and to feelings of loss, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a second. In the poem, she makes some comparisons, and summer is compared to grief and how both move on and pass, and dusk is compared to a guest leaving. As I said before, she lived in seclusion and isolation, and I think if you read into this poem a little deeper, you'll see that this idea of the guest leaving perhaps suggests and reinforces her isolation, and her desperation is shown within these comparisons. So back to the first line, imperceptibly as grief, the summer passed away. So we have here the ideas of loss and bereavement, death and things moving on, and perhaps the fact that we are unable to stop that passage of time. As summer subtly resides, so does grief. But in this sense, there's a feeling of betrayal. Okay, we feel it should not go. We don't want summer to leave us. We want to enjoy. We want to be in the sun. Grief is exactly the same in many respects. It has an all-consuming feeling, but it does pass and it does go. It also, as I said before, has connotations of death and loss. Now, we're presented in this poem with the literal death of summer as we move from one season to the next, but also the symbolic as we leave our emotions, the departure of emotions as they go. Dickinson employs many different words, such as perfidy, meaning treachery or disloyalty, and sequestered, which is that idea of things being hidden. Now, that also means that kind of being pushed away or secluded. So it's reinforcing again that feeling of isolation, but we also get this feeling of things being untrustworthy. So this sense of going against us. Now the tone of the poem is pretty sad, is pretty low, and also shows that, you know, there's a lot of angst and upset. But as it moves through the poem, the tone does subtly change. So we have some beautiful words and imagery which are also used to convey her complete distress. A quietness distilled. Now this word means purified. As twilight long begun, or nature spending with herself. Now, it's important there that we see the capital, and also that nature is described as herself. So it's been given an identity. The adjective distilled, as I said before, shows the idea of purification. But again, there's this underlying sadness. Dickinson uses personification to develop the theme of nature. Personification, as I'm sure you're all aware, is when you give an object a human quality. And in this sense, she's giving nature this human quality. She's bringing nature to life. She's giving it a personality. Or nature spending with herself sequestered afternoon. So kind of nature spending time hidden away, removed from everything. We can see here that time is once again being taken away, and this again reinforces the theme of isolation. A voluntary, a withdrawal from the world. There is perhaps a slight underlying sense of disquiet, so that there is something negative, something sinister. The final two lines of the poem, "Our summer made her light escape into the beautiful," alters that sombre and serene tone slightly. And we get this feeling that actually the beautiful conveys hope, and that there is something mysterious and ethereal, and that we're moving to the light. This personal pronoun, our, shows this sense of possession and perhaps again personal loss. But it is, as Emily Dickinson was a Puritan, she knew that God was a benevolent God. She believed that God had grace and that he gave humanity and really helped people. And despite this harrowing sense of grief, perhaps at all times there is also a sense of hope. Okay, moving on to structure. Now, the structure of the poem, originally, it was in 8 stanzas. It's now, as you can see, in only 1 stanza, okay? But it does fall evenly into 4 quatrains, so lines of 4. And that could reflect the seasons and the shifts of the seasons, which, again, is a central theme to Imperceptibly as grief. Furthermore, it's written in blank verse. The first syllable is weak, the second stronger. Reading it like this, we can hear an obvious beat. We can also see that keywords tend to be stronger. So imperceptibly, summer, imperceptible, quietness, twilight, nature, dusk, morning, courteous, guest, keel, summer and beautiful. And just hearing these lines, we can still make some sense of the lines. Okay, to conclude, you can compare Imperceptibly as Grief to London by Blake and Passage of Time. Now, obviously with London by Blake, you've got this sense of injustice and cruelty, but also a bit of kind of grief about how society's become. With Dickinson's Imperceptibly as Grief, the grief is there, but it's very much an internal grief. It's very much a personal response, and it also, again, explores this idea of passage of time. Okay, thank you, and good luck with your exams.